This is the seventh, I believe it's the seventh, and last in the Studies of Great Event series of Old Testament characters and some of their activities. Our focus this evening will be on Daniel, and specifically, we will take a look at Daniel's relationship with God and how it is revealed in the Lion's Den event. We're going to look at some things leading up to where Daniel is, and then we'll get into the book of Daniel. Last Wednesday night, I think Kevin Rosenbaum, in his invitation comments, made reference to Hezekiah. Sunday morning, Jeff Walker led a class, and Hezekiah was part of the focus of that class. Hezekiah was a king in Judah, and we don't hear him mentioned usually at 3 consecutive services, but Hezekiah has made the role here recently. Hezekiah was a king of Judah. As Jeff pointed out Sunday morning, he was a good king, at least in the early part of his reign. Hezekiah had been a fairly good king for roughly 15 years. And in 2 Kings chapter 20, he became ill. And upon becoming ill, he pled to God, and God added 15 years to Hezekiah's life. Unfortunately, Hezekiah did some things after that were less than ideal. The Babylonians came to visit him and talk to him about his illness. He proceeded to show them all of the treasuries in his kingdom. He showed them through his house. He showed them some of the temple type things. God was not happy with Hezekiah. And if I can make this thing work, I'm going to read from 2 Kings chapter 20, verses 16 through 18. 2 Kings 20, 16 through 18. Isaiah is going to be mentioned. Isaiah is a prophet of God living during the time of Isaiah. And God sends a message through Isaiah to Hezekiah. Then Isaiah said to Hezekiah, "Hear the word of the Lord. Behold, the days are coming when all that is in your house and that which your fathers have stored up till this day shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, says the Lord. And some of your own sons who shall be born to you shall be taken away, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon." God was not very happy with Hezekiah. Many years later, Jeremiah told the people of Jerusalem that they were going to be captive for 70 years. This is found in Jeremiah chapter 25, verse 11. This captivity was because of not listening to God. References are made to this captivity being partially because of the sins of Manasseh, a later king, and it was also because of idolatry. God was fed up with people not following his will, not following his covenant, and God was judging the people because of their failure of obedience. Jeremiah was a prophet in Jerusalem as the Babylonians were taking over. The overthrow of Jerusalem is described as having been in 3 different times. People sometimes refer to these as waves, but there were 3 different waves that occurred over a period of 18 to 19 years. The first one was during the reign of Jehoiakim. It's found in 2 Kings 24, verses 1 through 7. The second wave was during the reign of Jehoiachin, which was in 2 Kings 24, verses 10 through 17. And the third was during the reign of Zedekiah in 2 Kings 25. This slide kind of shows those times. My apologies to the pronunciation of the names. I've heard some of these names said a variety of ways, and I'm sure I won't say them correctly, so that's the best I can do. Now, there are some contemporaries during this period of time. Jeremiah is a prophet in Jerusalem, and he's telling the people what's going to happen and why it's happening. While he's doing that, Ezekiel and Daniel were carried off into captivity. And Daniel, eventually, I think after about 5 years of captivity, Ezekiel was prophesying to the people in Babylon, telling them that they were being judged, to settle down, to live their lives, and everything would work out for them. That was basically the message of Ezekiel. So you've got Jeremiah in Jerusalem preaching to the people who have not yet been taken captive, and you've got Ezekiel preaching to the exiles. Daniel is also there in Babylon. So with that, we're going to look at Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 through 7. Daniel chapter 1, 1 through 7. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, and some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance, and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave these names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. So, what do we know about Daniel based on Daniel chapter 1, 1 through 7? Okay, somebody said good looking, smart. A good looking, smart, young kid. We're not told how old Daniel was. As you read through what people write, many speculate that he was somewhere between the ages of 10 and 15. Don't know, but he was not an old person. This says that it was during the reign of Jehoiakim, so he was in the first wave of captives. This is fulfilling what was told to Hezekiah in 2 Kings 20, 16 to 18 that we started with this evening. Daniel chapter 10, verse 2 tells us that Daniel was serving during the Persian king Cyrus in the 3rd year of his reign. Now, what is relevant about that is that the captives were allowed to go back home if they wanted to during the 1st year of the reign of King Cyrus. So what does this tell us about Daniel? Daniel was in captivity for the entirety of the 70 years when God was judging his people. Daniel was there the entire time. It was mentioned that Daniel was a good-looking guy. He was skillful in wisdom and capable of learning. Daniel and his friends were to be educated in the literature and language of the Chaldeans, and there were to be 3 years spent in this educational process. His name was called Belteshazzar. Daniel means God has judged. God has judged. Belteshazzar is named after a Babylonian god. This is identified in Daniel chapter 4, verse 8. So it's kind of interesting that Daniel has this name that means God has judged, and there he is in captivity for the entire 70 years. The order had been given that these captives were to eat the king's food and drink the king's wine. Now, we're not told of the problems that this would represent to the Hebrew people, but Daniel and his friends, his 3 friends, who are described here as being from the tribe of Judah, refused to defile themselves with the king's food. We're told in chapter 1, verse 9, that God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the eunuchs. Daniel requested a period of time to eat what he and his 3 friends wanted to eat and not the king's food. With God helping him, Daniel was allowed a 3-day test. He and his friends ate vegetables and drank water, not the things from the king's menu. And we're told that after 3 days, the chief of the eunuchs looked at Daniel and decided that he and his friends had passed the test, and they were allowed to continue with that diet for the entire 3-year period. We're going to read from Daniel chapter 1, verses 19 through 21. And at this period of time, all of these people who had been on this 3-year educational process and this 3-year diet are presented before the king. Beginning in chapter 1, verse 19, "And the king spoke with them, and among all of them none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding, about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom." So, what do we learn about Daniel based on the conclusion of this 3-year period? It's found in chapter 1, 19 to 20. Yes? Okay, God was with him. God helped Daniel and his 3 friends pass this test. Although a captive, Daniel intended to remain true to the Hebrew dietary expectations. After going through that, Daniel and his friends were judged better than the others who had gone through the same thing. And as is pointed out, it was apparent that God had blessed Daniel and his friends. In Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, has a dream, and it's a troubling dream. The problem is that Nebuchadnezzar couldn't remember the dream, and he certainly had no idea what it meant. So he called his magicians and enchanters and other Chaldeans who are collectively called wise men later on, he told them to tell him his dream and interpret the dream for him. None could do it. Can you imagine that? Nebuchadnezzar the king was angry, and he decreed that all of them were to be killed, including Daniel and his friends. Failure to repeat and interpret a dream that someone else had was a cause of death in the eyes of Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel learned of this and asked for time to interpret the dream. I'm going to read from Daniel chapter 2, verses 17 through the first part of chapter 19. Daniel chapter 2, verse 17. Then Daniel went to his house and made this matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions. And he told them to seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night. So, upon learning that he was about to die, as were his three friends, Daniel went to his friends and he asked them to pray on his behalf. Daniel asked his friends for prayer. Verse 18 says, "Seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery." The goal was so that their lives might not be lost. Their very lives were at stake. I'm going to reread verse 19 and then continue on. Then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision that night. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel answered and said, "Blessed be the name of the God forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what it is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we asked of you, for you have made known to us the king's matter." Okay, so what do we learn about Daniel from chapter 2, verses 17 through 23? Steve.
Through all of his and his three friends' success and accomplishments, he seemed to be very humble and realized that all of this comes from God and gives God the credit for it, even as he's appealing to God for help and assistance.
Yes. Daniel was very humble here. Daniel, let me back up. Prayer was obviously very much a part of the life of Daniel and of his friends. As we listen to this prayer of praise, Daniel recognizes God as being over everything, over wisdom and might, over seasons, over governments, all-knowing. He dwells in light, and yet at the same time, God knows what is going on in darkness. Daniel gave praise and thanksgiving to God for making this dream known and effectively saving their lives. Daniel went to King Nebuchadnezzar and interpreted the dream for him, giving credit to God for revealing the dream and its interpretation. Nebuchadnezzar was delighted. I'd intended to read Daniel 2, 46 to 49, but we're going to skip that. In this prayer that Nebuchadnezzar offered, or this praise that he offered, he actually praised God. Nebuchadnezzar elevated Daniel, gave Daniel high honors and many great gifts. He made Daniel ruler over all the provinces of Babylon. He made Daniel prefect over all the wisdom of Babylon. And at Daniel's request, Nebuchadnezzar also made Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. Here, this pagan king was acknowledging God because of what God had done through Daniel. In Daniel chapter 5, Daniel interprets another dream for in chapter 4, Daniel interprets another dream for Nebuchadnezzar. And then in chapter 5, Daniel interprets a dream for Belshazzar, a successor of Nebuchadnezzar, who is described as Nebuchadnezzar's son. The dream that Daniel interpreted related to arrogance. Belshazzar did not immediately change directions, and that very night, the Medes overthrew Babylon, as Daniel had predicted in the dream. We're told that Darius the Mede became the leader of the kingdom, formerly known as Babylonia. That brings us to Daniel chapter 6, and we're going to spend quite a bit of time there. I'm going to read Daniel chapter 6, verses 1 through 3. And it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one, and to whom these satraps should give account, so that the king might suffer no loss. Then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him. And the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Okay, so Daniel was one of 3 who was elevated to a position where essentially the providential leaders reported to. So Daniel and 2 other guys were there. Why was Daniel elevated and distinguished above his peers? An excellent spirit was in him. Have you known people who've had an excellent spirit in them? Think through that. The king intended to set Daniel over the entire kingdom. Let's read on Daniel 6, verses 4 through 9. Then the high officials and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom, but they could find no ground for complaint or any fault, because he was faithful, and no error or fault was found in him. Then these men said, "We shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God." Then these high officials and satraps came to an agreement to the king, or came by agreement to the king, and said to him, "O King Darius, live forever. All the high officials of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the counselors and the governors, are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it cannot be changed, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked." Therefore, King Darius signed the document and injunction. The other leaders appear to be jealous of Daniel. Doesn't say that, but that appears to be what's going on. So, what problem did the other leaders discover when trying to find ground for complaint against Daniel? There was none. They could find no ground for filing a complaint against him. Daniel is described in verse 4 as being faithful. No error or fault was found in him. Wouldn't it be great to have our own lives examined and to be found as faithful, no error or fault found? I wouldn't pass. I don't know about you, but I certainly wouldn't. So, where did these leaders believe Daniel to be vulnerable? Praying to his own God. They determined that something in connection to the law of his God was where he was vulnerable. Now, keep in mind that this Medo-Persian Empire was large. It included all of what Babylon had ruled, plus land further to the east. Therefore, there were lots of gods through these lands. The Creator God would not have been the God most followed. Probably a fairly limited number of people were actually following the living Creator God. So, what plan did these high officials put in place?
Make a new law that Daniel would not comply with, and then catch him not complying with it.
Okay, make a new law that Daniel wouldn't comply with, and then catch him not complying. And they did it on the basis of prayer. We've talked 2 or 3 times here this evening about Daniel praying and his friends praying. Daniel asking his friends for prayer. Whoever petitions any god or man other than the king for 30 days is to be cast into the den of lions. King Darius signed the document, and it could not be changed. This prohibited anyone throughout this huge kingdom from praying to anyone except King Darius. Now, I want us to think through what this would represent in today's world. This would have been parts of modern Egypt and parts of modern Saudi Arabia. It would have been parts of Turkey to the northwest. It included the area along the Mediterranean coast, what we now know as Israel and Lebanon and Syria. And you move across the Jordan River, and it would have included what is modern Jordan. It would have included almost all of what is now Iran and Iraq and parts of Afghanistan and Pakistan. Think about what a massive geographic area that is. This would have encompassed a lot of people and a lot of pagan gods in addition to the living God. I'm going to read Daniel chapter 6, verse 10. When Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he had done previously. So, how did Daniel respond upon learning that this document had been signed forbidding prayer to anyone other than King Darius? Okay, he disregarded it. Daniel ignored it. Daniel didn't go out and protest. He didn't go out with picket signs. John?
He just continued in his regular prayer regimen. In fact, he even prayed towards Jerusalem, just as Psalm had talked about people needed to do. Back in Psalm, I think it's chapter 8.
Okay. Steve, I saw you had a hand up over here.
I was thinking that it doesn't seem that he did this out of rebellion, because as we looked in verse 4, the governors and satraps are looking for things against him. They call him faithful. They wouldn't have necessarily been referring to faithful to God,
Right.
but faithful to the kingdom, trustworthy
Okay. All right. Yes. Daniel went in, he got on his knees, he started praying. He did it 3 times a day, just as he had always done. Let's go ahead and read. I'll redo verse 10 and go on to verse 15. When Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he had done previously. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and plea before his God. Then they came near and said before the king concerning the injunction, "O king, did you not sign an injunction that anyone who makes petition to any god or man within 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into a den of lions?" The king answered and said, "The thing stands fast according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be revoked." Then they answered and said before the king, "Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or the injunction you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day." Then the king, when he heard these words, was much distressed and set his mind to deliver Daniel. And he labored till the sun went down to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, "Know, O king, that it is a law of the Medes and Persians that no injunction or ordinance that the king establishes can be changed." So the men who had persuaded King Darius to issue this ridiculous order witnessed Daniel praying to the living God, violating the king's order. They went to the king and they ratted out Daniel for praying to the living God rather than to King Darius. Now, as we think through this, was the king surprised? No. We're told when the king heard these words about Daniel, he was much distressed and set his mind to deliver Daniel. The king knew what Daniel was going to do. Why the king didn't think of that before he signed the injunction, I don't know. But nevertheless, this was the predicament that the king had him in. Daniel paid no attention. So I answered my own question, how did King Darius react? He wasn't very happy and was trying to figure a way. Daniel chapter 6, verses 16 through 18. Then the king commanded, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. The king declared to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you." And a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his lords, that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and sleep fled from him. So, how did King Darius feel about throwing Daniel in the lion's den? He didn't feel great about it, did he? No, he felt terrible. Steve?
Yeah, from my translation in verse 14 says he was displeased with himself, not with Daniel. Oh, what have I done?
Okay. Now, your New American Standard?
New King James.
New King James. Okay, I'm reading from the ESV in case anybody wondered. So the New King James has a little different twist there. Yes, John.
Well, yeah, he was upset. He favored Daniel. Even the official could tell that the king favored Daniel, even for the fact that he was going to put him in charge over all of his kingdom above them. And they probably didn't like maybe losing a chance of their positions being set in stone, you could say. But also the fact that line of thought here, but, you know, he was upset, and I think maybe he was upset with the officials themselves that he got roped into this. I think maybe he was distressed about Daniel, but also mad at those officials, and maybe that's why he didn't sleep that well that night, too.
All right. John says that he was not only upset because of what was happening to Daniel, but he was upset with the people who had got him to sign this. And that's going to be confirmed here in our next reading. Mike? Okay. Yep. He was not happy. Yep. Okay, Daniel chapter 6, verses 19 to 23. Then at daybreak, the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions. And as he came near to the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? Then Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him and also before you. O king, I have done no harm. Then the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. So, what attributes of Daniel did King Darius use when he called to Daniel in the lion's den the next morning? Servant of the living God, who you serve continually. King Darius, again, knew that Daniel was a servant follower of the living God. Daniel attributes God to having saved him. We're told that Daniel was rescued because he had trusted in his God. And as John and Mike have kind of pointed out here, if you read further, the people who had concocted this plan to get rid of Daniel, and again, in my opinion, because of jealousy, they were thrown into the den of lions along with their wives and their children. And we're told that the bones of all of them were crushed before they got to the bottom of the pit. All right, we're going to skip through a few things. But Daniel was a man of prayer, and the king's ordinance was not going to interfere with his relationship with God. We remember earlier, Daniel stayed on a diet that did not violate the Hebrew law in chapter 1. He prayed and asked his friends to pray to enable him to interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2. We're told here in chapter 3 that Daniel had an excellent spirit in him. Daniel gave credit to God for granting knowledge and interpretation of dreams. And then we read Daniel's prayer of praise to God in chapter 2. Daniel had a very positive relationship with God, trying to be faithful, irrespective of the consequences. Luke Walker preached a sermon to us in early December. I thought it was a magnificent sermon, personally. He spoke about God's design, that man's purpose was to walk alongside God and share his rule with him. Luke pointed out that the rest of the Bible story is trying to get man back into this role. We started tonight with John chapter 17, verse 3. This is in a prayer of Jesus. In this prayer, Jesus prays for himself. He prays for the 11, and then he prays for those who will follow after, which includes you and me. But in John chapter 17, verse 3, he says, "This is eternal life, that they know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom you serve, who you sent." Eternal life is knowing God and knowing his Son, who he sent to save us. As Luke described walking alongside God, as we've looked at Daniel tonight, we've seen someone living under the old covenant who was a captive, who was unable to do all the things that he wanted to do, one would think, and yet he remained faithful to God. At various times tonight, we have mentioned the prophet Isaiah, we have mentioned the prophet Jeremiah, we have mentioned the prophet Ezekiel, and we have mentioned Daniel. All of those guys had a relationship with God. But think about it. Not one of those people had access to God through Jesus Christ like you and I have. Just as Luke mentioned about our walking alongside God, our lives need to be intertwined with God. If we want eternal life, we have to be engaged in relationship with God through Jesus. And in Jesus' prayer, he talks about our relationships with one another. Relationship with God through Jesus Christ and relationship with each other. Okay, any quick comments or questions? Yeah.
I think it's interesting. Daniel is described many times as being extremely wise, having an extraordinary spirit, being able to understand all these things. And when his command comes out, I imagine he probably thought, how can I get out of this? There's no answer but to remain faithful to God. And I sacrifice myself. He had that much faith.
Yes. Kevin mentions that Daniel had enough faith to sacrifice himself when there were no other ways apparent to be out. And God delivered him. God delivered him. And God, John chapter 10, verse 10, Jesus talks about he had come to give life and to give it abundantly. Abundant life is not the prosperity gospel that we hear preached a lot in some places. Eternal life is knowing God and knowing Jesus Christ who he sent. Okay, thank you so much for being here, for participating in class, and thanks to Mark for handling the video stuff because I am clueless when it comes to doing this.